My guest is Mark Mix. He's president of the National Right to Work Committee. It's a 2.8 million member public policy organization. Also serves as president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Mark, it's great to have you on. Good morning, sir.
Bill, good to be on with you. Thank you very much.
So, Mark, when someone talks about right to work, I thought we all have the right to work. In some cases, the duty or the necessity to work, national necessity to work. Otherwise, don't eat much and can't keep my cats in good, expensive kibble at home. So, what is an actual right to work? What do you mean by that? Maybe people are even confused by the term.
Yeah, it's really simple. I mean, there are 27 states that have passed right-to-work laws today, and the statutes on the books in those states basically protect an individual worker from being fired if they don't tender dues or fees to a labor union. So in 23 states across the country, you can lose your job because you don't support a private organization for the right to work. In states like Michigan and 26 other states, workers have that choice to decide for themselves whether or not they want to financially support a labor union. It's really that simple. The right to work law protects your right to join. It protects your right to participate in a union. It doesn't offend that in any way, but it says you can't lose your job if you disagree with what the union official is doing in your workplace. You don't have to pay them in order to work.
Now, do you have to pay them for, let's say, the costs of negotiating for a contract, let's say, but maybe you don't pay to elect Democratic politicians or Republican politicians or whatever the case might be? It's probably mostly Democratic politicians, I would figure.
Yeah, that's right. In the states that don't have right-to-work laws, you can actually do that. You can use a Supreme Court decision that we won, our National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation won back in 1988, called Beck versus Communication Workers of America. And that case basically played out exactly with what you just said, that it said that workers can be compelled to pay fees to a union for, quote, representational activities like bargaining for a contract, but they can't be forced to pay for ideological causes or politics that the union officials would engage in. And your hypothesis about where that money goes to one party is absolutely correct, Bill. But what in the right to work states, basically because unions have been granted a very unique power, and it's a power of exclusive monopoly representation, that means that you as an individual cannot speak to your employer if a union is present. It means that you, if you're in a unionized situation and you decide you don't want to pay for politics, you can't vote on the contract that governs your employment. You can't vote in union elections. You can't participate in any activity in the company or with the union if you decide that you object to the political and ideological causes that union officials use your money to fund. So it's a really Hobson's choice. On one hand, you have to, in order to protect your workplace rights, you have to give up your political rights. In right-to-work states, that choice doesn't have to be made. You basically say, I want out of this, I don't want to pay. And if the unions would give up their monopoly bargaining privilege, meaning their ability to be the sole voice in the workplace, then I think workers would say, yeah, I'll pay for this or I'll pay for that.
Sure.
But right now, because the unions are the sole voice, we can't. That's an unbelievable privilege they have over workers.
And of course, you'd like me to represent you in that next union conversation with the boss, wouldn't you? Nice job you had there. Be ashamed to see something happen to it. Just saying. Sorry, I always kind of default back to my Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania upbringing, in which there was a lot of union activity back when I was growing up.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. And unfortunately, that's one of the manifestations of it. I mean, if a worker decides they want to exercise their rights, sometimes the pressure that comes, like when a new worker comes in and all of a sudden produces 8 widgets in an hour and everyone else is making 4, somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, slow down, you're making us look bad here. Those are the types of things that disincentivize productivity, disincentivize people actually working hard and doing things that are productive for them and maybe not for the, quote, collective, if you will.
Mark, what got you involved in this line of work to actually be fighting for the right to work? Were you someone that was affected by this at some point and you just said, hey, I'm really PO'd about it? I'd like to know a little bit more about your story.
Well, Bill, I started working. I grew up in a single-parent home. My mom worked as a dishwasher in a school cafeteria. She married my stepfather was a 32-year member of the International Association of Machinists. He was a welder. My brother was a school teacher in a New York State school system and forced to pay dues and fees to keep his job. And so I grew up on the union side of the tracks, if you will. But then, as I kind of got educated about liberty, freedom, big concepts like that, as I increased my education, I realized this idea of compulsion and force and monopoly granted to a private organization over workers' livelihoods doesn't make any sense at all in this grand experiment in self-government where we believe in individual rights, where we believe in the right to associate. And those rights can't exist if the contrary rights don't exist as well. The idea, if you can be forced to associate, if you have freedom to associate, you have the freedom not to associate. And organized labor has used their political power to become a powerful government entity, if you will, not only over government workers, and that's a whole other story, but the idea of their wards of the state. It was Samuel Gompers, Bill, known as the father of the American Union movement, who said this in his final speech to the AFL delegates in El Paso, Texas in 1924. The workers of America adhere to voluntary institutions. Anything else is a menace to his rights, to their rights. And what he meant was, if you go to government and try to grab the power to have government force people into your private organizations, you're going to lose the very value and the strength of an organization that comes together voluntarily by workers who want to be part of that to amplify their voice. So the union business model is wrong. They rely on force, compulsion, and government action as opposed to customer service and doing good things for workers in the workplace.
Now, union representation has been going down in the United States for quite some time. Isn't that the case, Mark?
Yeah, they represent just over 6% of the private sector workforce, and they represent about 35% of government workforces. And actually, Bill.
Okay, so union workers, for the most part, by and large, are government employees overall.
That's
right.
That's right. There are more government union members in America today than there are private sector union members.
One of the problems I've had with that is that essentially you have the government sector unions then negotiating for pay and benefits with the same people that they end up then sending money, political contributions to get these people elected. So I'm always concerned about if we really have honest brokers when we have public union wage and benefit negotiations. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you're in bed with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1937 when he was sent a letter by a union official after the federal government had imposed unionism and the compulsory unionism scheme on the private sector, said, why don't we do this in the government sector? And Franklin Roosevelt said it's unthinkable that we would do that in the government sector for exactly the reasons you just articulated, Bill, that, they're sitting on the same side of the table of the people they support in elections. In fact, you get bold pronouncements of this, like out in Sacramento, California, when an ASPE union official stood up and said, it's pretty cool that we get to elect our own bosses. And so that's the mindset you're talking about.
But, it's that way in the state of Oregon, too. By the way, is state of Oregon right to work or not right to work? Is it?
It is not. It is not. Workers can be fired in Oregon for failure to pay dues or fees to keep their jobs.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're part of the racket. Good to know. I think I kind of knew that already. Figured that just because the way things have been running. Now, is there not a case? I'm going to ask you a devil's advocate question. Given what we're seeing here with the growth of these huge multinational corporations, and some of them pretty abusive. I think of Amazon as an example, which we're going to work you to death, make you pee in a bottle, and have artificial intelligence monitor you at all times and things like that. I mean, isn't that an example when having a union of those kind of workers might be actually helpful?
Absolutely. And, people often say, well, there was a place for unions back in the turn of the century in the 1800s, the 1900s, when we kind of introduced ourselves to the Industrial Revolution. And, the horror stories that we read in our history books tell us that, it was only because unions got entered that we got a balance in the workplace. What I say is there was a place for unions, there is a place for unions, there will be a place for unions, but there's no place for government compulsion and force in that environment.
So that's what you're getting at with the National Right to Work Committee and the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. That's what I was trying. I appreciate you kind of explaining it a bit more. I just wanted to find out, are you just a pure anti-union screed coming out every day, or is there some understanding and some balance? And it seems like you're very nuanced about that, and I appreciate it. All right.
Yeah.
Mark, let me then shift. And the reason I actually brought you on here in the first place is that I wanted to talk about what we're dealing with the supply chain crimp, the supply chain problems, the loads of boats off of the L.A. ports and Long Beach and everything else, and nothing seems to be moving. And we're just told that, hey, it's because people are just wanting too many things right now, and we can't find enough truck drivers, et cetera, et cetera. What role, if any, have unions played in the problems we're dealing with supply chains? Anything?
Well, Bill, they played a big role in that. And the International Labor Longshoremen and Warehouse Union out on the West Coast that controls 29 ports from Seattle all the way down to San Diego have kind of a hammerlock on how things get done at the ports. I mean, you may remember the strike back in 2002 that basically was about the implementation of scanners, sensors, and barcodes on the ports, basically to improve the efficiency of the ports and how they move containers.
Right.
The union went out on strike over that. They didn't want any automation. Back in 1971, the longest strike on the ports on the West Coast was 130 days. That was over the containerization of products. They opposed containers, and that's the the ultimate shipping method right now. But here's what happens. I mean, that contract for the ILWU is up in 2022. So they've got to prove that there are things that need to be done at the ports now. And I think there's some part of this slowdown is part of that. But you mentioned the other two things. The legislation in California dealing with AB 5, the idea that independent contractors would be now designated as employees. Unions like that because you can't unionize independent contractors, but you can unionize employees. So the owner-operator truck drivers that were servicing the port and, driving their chassis in, getting containers, moving them into warehouses or railheads or into the economy, they have made a decision not to service California anymore because they're independent operators and owner-operators for a reason in many cases. But yet the legislation and the laws in California and the regulations are basically driving those truck drivers out of the system. So that creates the void that we have in getting trucks in. The next part of it is warehouse workers. When you pay people not to go to work, you tend to basically disincentivize getting up in the morning and going to work. And we've had a whole year and a half of all that. So there's no surprise that that we don't have enough workers in those types of positions. But the bottom line is, the infrastructure bill that passed on Friday that Joe Biden is waiting to sign has $17 billion for port infrastructure. But none of that money, Bill, catch this, can be used for increases in automation.
Well, then what could it be used for? Because it would seem that increasing the efficiency is exactly what's needed, Mark.
That's exactly right. And, it'll be used for emissions control and some of those things that you can't, if your truck's over 2000, if you have a truck that's earlier than 2011, you can't drive it on the port. I mean, these types of infrastructure projects, I'm using my finger quotes here, that are basically the Green New Deal and some of those things that are really going to put the cramp on things as they get implemented. So, you think automation, and an interesting story about that. The most recent infrastructure of a port that we built in the United States opened in March of this year. It's called the Hugh Leatherman Port in Charleston, South Carolina. It's the biggest port. It's got these huge cranes that can unload some of the biggest cargo ships in the world that carry, 23,000 containers, if you can imagine that. Well, when a couple of ships were on their way to this new port to use the new technology and use the work there, the International Longshoremen's Association, the union on the East Coast, basically said anyone who goes there and uses the employees, some of them non-union because they're state employees, they're not ILA members, said if you go there, we're going to file a lawsuit. And file a lawsuit they did. They filed a $300 million lawsuit against two shipping companies saying that if you went to that port, they were going to take you to court and they were going to slow down and they weren't going to unload your stuff. And so we have the most efficient port in the country right now basically sitting idle because of a union control problem. And when you look at the ports in the United States, 40% of all imports in the United States come through Long Beach and Los Angeles, those two ports. And right now I think there's 80 cargo ships sitting out in the bay out there waiting to be unloaded. But the World Bank just recently completed a port performance index about the efficiency and the effectiveness of ports. I
would be really curious, Mark, to know just how efficient these union-controlled West Coast ports are. What's happening?
And the World Bank tells us, this is World Bank, this is not Mark Mix, this is the World Bank saying this, that of 350 ports in the world, from all these countries you can imagine, names that I can't pronounce, Los Angeles and Long Beach rank 328 and 333 out of 350 ports in the world for efficiency and the amount of time it takes to get a ship in, unloaded, and back out.
God bless America, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
The first port on the West Coast that shows up is Seattle at number 238, I believe. So, that's the type of power and the inefficiencies that exist in these ports. And
so I just want to make sure, though, you say that those low port rankings, which also means low amount of goods getting into our stores, et cetera, and the crimps, everything else we're dealing with, is this official union policy? Or is it a symptom but not the actual root of it? What do you think?
Well, you would have to ask them about that. I mean, they're in the business of keeping people employed so they can pay union dues. And one of the elements of the 2002 strike when they tried to introduce scanners and sensors and barcodes was that the ultimate end of that was that any non-union job in that environment had to be unionized. And then, Bill, they said this: any job that might get displaced by this automation, that individual could maintain their job until they decided to retire.
Wow.
Now, if I'm 25-year-old and I'm in charge of putting chalk marks on a container, and all of a sudden we now have a barcode that does that, maybe I could work for 40 more years at full pay. That doesn't sound efficient to me. That's a hypothetical, of course, but those were the terms of settlement for introducing real basic automation into the ports. I mean, the fact that you and I can talk, I'm sitting in a parking lot in Detroit, Michigan, talking with you on a little thing that I'm holding to my ear, and we're broadcasting on your station, and yet somehow that type of automation and technological advancement can't take place in ports because there's a roadblock, and that roadblock is the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union. Is
there not a case to be made? And like I said, when it comes to unions trying to protect workers from safety and issues and real grievances that I remember that they did a pretty good job of, back in the day, shouldn't these unions be broken just as a matter of national security? And I know that's kind of maybe that's a radical proposal, but I'm at least going to bring it up.
Well, I think when we've had other emergencies, like in California with the earthquake, when Pete Wilson basically said, we're going to set aside union construction regulations to make sure we can rebuild their city, and they did it under budget and before the deadlines were imposed. I mean, there's a rationale for that. This president, however, will not do that. We know that.
Okay,
all right. He's the most pro-union president, and what he means by that, he's the most pro-forced unionism president in America. I mean, if he was a pro-union president, he wouldn't have put literally thousands of pipe fitters and operating engineers that were working on the Keystone Pipeline in Middle America on the unemployment line in the first week of his administration. Those were all union jobs that he put on the unemployment line. So he's for a really big labor, and he's for the really big bosses of big labor.
But you're really talking about big bosses that keep political contributions going to one political party, in essence.
You got that right. You got
all right.
that right.
Where do you see the ripest opportunity for reform to restore some balance between the union, government, and private sector relationship? Anything?
Well, we've got a bill. It's a one-page bill in this era of 2,700-page infrastructure bills and 5,000-page reconciliation bills. A one-page bill that doesn't add a single word to federal law, Bill. It simply repeals provisions in the 1935 federal policy that imposes forced unionism on the country. If we could get right to work passed as a national statute, then union rank-and-file workers would have accountability. They would have power over union officials who do weird things with their money when they have compulsion enforced. No farther, I'm being in Detroit today, no farther than the United Auto Workers, who have at least 12 top executives in jail today serving prison time for embezzling and stealing and for corruption and bribes. I mean, we have another one that just got indicted the other day. This is because they have this power that's extraordinary for a private organization, the ability to use government power to compel someone to pay them in order to work. If we can solve that problem, I think we're on the road to making union officials effective again in representing employees at their workplace, not in state capitals around the country.
Are there any sponsors of this bill right now, or is anybody helping trying to push this through right now, this bill?
Yeah, well, I think we've got about 95 co-sponsors in the House. We've got 21, 22 in the Senate. Rand Paul is the primary sponsor in the Senate.
Okay.
Joe Wilson from South Carolina is the primary sponsor in the House. That bill's pending right now in the House of Representatives. And, Bill, you might guess what the treatment is from the current leadership, but we're working on getting a roll call vote so Americans can see who's for freedom and who's for coercion in the American workplace.
Mark Mix, we appreciate you coming on the show this morning, Mark. He's president of the National Right to Work Committee, National Right to Work Legal Defense Fund, and nrtw.org is your main website to read up more on this issue. Isn't that right?
That's right. You got it, Bill. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a privilege.
And thank you. Good talk about that. We know more about the right to work issue and also how a lot of this is connected with our slowdowns and various other issues that we're facing right now in the supply chains. Thanks so much. You be well and keep fighting, my friend.
I will.